Former U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger once said that control oil and you control nations, control food and you control the people. A food crisis has loomed as the Russia-Ukraine conflict marks its second month on April the 24th. The two countries together account for approximately 1/3 of global wheat exports. How much of the global food supply is disrupted? How prepared is the world in dealing with this potential crisis, and what are the other possible root causes of the situation? I'm pleased to be joined in Beijing by Matteo Marchisio, Country Director for Asia and the Pacific of the International Fund for Agricultural Development and International Financial Institution of the United Nations, and in Rome, Italy, by Professor Michele Geraci at Nottingham University, Ningbo, China, who is also a former Undersecretary of State at the Italian Ministry of Economic Development. Gentlemen, welcome to The Point, especially Michele, long time no see, and thanks for joining us at this late moment. So let me go to Matteo first. Welcome back on the show, by the way. And you recently said that food prices and global food security are under enormous stress. What do you mean by that? How severe is the situation?
Yes, well, good morning, everyone. The situation is severe. I mean, if we look at the current situation, and I'm referring to the Ukraine conflict, which followed 2 years of COVID pandemic, that already put under pressure, under enormous pressure, the global agricultural production and food distribution, already putting under stress food security in the world. If we consider that situation, there are all elements that can worsen the global food security in the world. As you rightly said, Ukraine and Russia account for about 1/3 of global wheat production, and more than 50 countries, that is to say 1/4 of the countries in the world, depend on Ukraine and Russia for more than 1/3 of their food imports. I mean, if we consider all those elements, and if we look at what's happening in Ukraine, where food production, harvest and export is undermined, we see all these elements reflecting in an increase of food prices, which affect global food security.
Are we already in a crisis yet, or we are potentially looking at a crisis? How would you describe the situation, Matteo, once again?
Yes, I think we are definitely already in a crisis. Now, rather, whether this crisis will be as serious as the 2008-2009 food crisis, we don't know. We don't have the elements yet. But I think it should not be underestimated. We are already entering the food crisis in the world.
Could you give us a little bit more supporting evidence? Because you say the situation, we're already in the crisis, but we can't compare to the situation in 2007, 2008 yet. Are there strong numbers or examples that you can show us to tell that we are very much in, and the situation in Ukraine is putting extra pressure? What are some of the evidence you can cite here?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the easiest data to refer to is the food index price, which is already 37% higher than the previous year. As a matter of fact, this year the food index is the highest since we start recording the food index. I'm a bit uncertain on the scope of magnitude of the crisis, because, as a matter of fact, we don't know how long the conflict will last, and we don't know yet how countries will react. Particularly, we don't know whether and to what extent country will implement protectionist measures or food restriction measures. That would be really bad if it happens.
Are we potentially exaggerating the situation? Because some pockets, some part of the world, we are seeing very clear signs of soaring food prices, but in some other parts of the world, the situation seems to be less severe, at least not immediate yet. How big is that a factor?
Well, as a matter of fact, the countries that are already food insecure, particularly countries in Africa or Middle East, as we are seeing, countries that import more than 50% of their cereal supply from Russia and Ukraine, are going to be more vulnerable and more affected by the crisis. within these countries, the poor population, the poorest segment of the society will be the most vulnerable and the most affected, simply because they have less capacity, less income and less savings to cope with an increase of food prices. This will put the real income down, and that will put them, they will push them further into poverty. So it's a kind of a vicious circle, vicious spiral that will put poor countries and poor people within poor countries under enormous stress.
What about the impoverished or the vulnerable groups in developed countries? Because we are seeing protests, for instance, in some southern European countries where they are also finding it very difficult to sustain the high oil prices and potentially other prices rising as well.
No, definitely they will also feel the effects of increasing food prices, no doubt about that. The big difference is that in more developed countries, government has systems, food safety nets or social protection measures that could help coping with this situation. The same safety nets, the same social protection measures are not existent are not existent in developing countries, and that's why we are particularly concerned on the impact of this conflict and the impact of the conflict on food prices, particularly in developing countries.
What about the potential impact of sanctions as a result of the war in Ukraine? Is there a impact there on the food security situation?
Well, I don't have all the elements to answer to this question. What I'm going to say is that in general, food export restrictions, protectionist measures do affect food prices and food security. We have already seen it in 2008. I mean, implementing protectionist measures could address the individual country specific food security problem. But in the medium or long term, this will create a chain effect by which each country has the temptation to react the same way, which will further increase prices, which will further deepen and worsen the food situation, and which will not benefit anyone.
Let me go to our guest in Italy, in Rome. Michele, we have to switch to telephone conversation here as the video quality is not good enough. What is your take on the situation? How severe is it? What are possibly the root causes of it? And how big of an impact is the war in Ukraine on food security?
There are many issues. The issue is serious. The main problem is, one, this is not a financial crisis like in 2008, which was, relatively speaking, easy to solve, because when the money is missing, you just print. When we talk about real goods crisis, you cannot print wheat cereals. And so the potential for this crisis is even bigger than the previous one. The second problem is that we are, like in the case of COVID, we have dynamic systems where the effects are only visible when it's probably too late. It's like an exponential growth of the problem. So at the moment, it's good that you and I discuss about this, but it is not, and I tell you almost as a fact, it is not the main worry of policy makers in Europe. So the problem brews underneath, and when it explodes, solution will be difficult for the reason that we said before, that you cannot print it. And of course, there are countries, I always look at Egypt as the key example, because it's a region or in Africa close to the Mediterranean. Egypt has a wheat balance that relies in almost 2/3 on exports. And within these exports, a lot does come from Russia and Ukraine. Almost 50%, 50, of Egypt's total cereal imports comes from those two countries. And so we are looking at not just an economic crisis, a social crisis, hunger crisis, and also migration. So this is really a big problem that is not properly addressed.
Michele, what is your recommendation then to address this big problem that has been brewing and could explode any time in the near future?
it's very easy. Policy makers, head of state should continue to go to Kiev, but they should go to Moscow and discuss a diplomatic settlement that will involve some losses for maybe the two parties involved, rather than continuing on insisting on a war, on sanctions, on an attitude that will just make people of Ukraine first suffer, only to end up on a game over situation, which is exactly what we were trying to negotiate back in February. So this war, the more it lasts, the more useless it is. And therefore, I urge people, I myself am trying to do that, go to Moscow, talk to Putin, and see how to stop this.
Thank you, Michele, joining us from Rome. I'm going to get back to Matteo. What is your recommendation that you are giving to governments around the world as to how to address this issue? What's the most urgent thing to do?
Well, first and foremost, end the conflict immediately. That would allow resuming production and food distribution in the world. Second, avoid protectionist measures and ban in food export. And third, in the short term, take care of the vulnerable people. Provide them with food, with resources, input, so that they can survive in the short terms. But in the medium and long term, re-establish the food supply chain and strengthen the resilience, the capacity of these people to cope with future shocks. Last year it was COVID, this year is the Ukraine conflict, next year we don't know, but those that suffer are always the most vulnerable, so we need to strengthen their capacity to cope with unforeseen events.
What about the policy by some countries to increase biofuels, the production or the export of biofuels, because that consumes agricultural products as well? Is there an impact there, or is it not big enough for concern?
Again, I don't have the figures here to provide a clear answer. My sense is that we should focus on food for eating. We should avoid the situation as 2008, where basically part of the problem was due to the fact that because of the increase of oil price, countries start shifting their agriculture production into crop for fuel, biofuels. I think that the key concern now is guaranteeing that food is provided to countries and to people that are in need of that.
We have to leave it there. Many thanks to Matteo Marchisio joining us from Beijing. Sorry about that. It's the second time. I won't do it the third time. But many thanks for your insight, and it's a very important discussion. And of course, to Michele Geraci joining us as Notre Dame University, Ningbo, China professor, a former Undersecretary of State at the Italian Ministry of Economic Development. With that, we come to the end of this edition of The Point with me, Michele. As always, you can follow me on Facebook and Twitter using the handle Michele in Beijing. On behalf of the whole team, thank you for joining us, and you've got the point.